Now, Ron, let's get back to the politics in the Boris direction, and we'll have a little listen now to his speech at the United Nations about Prometheus. I'm sure there'll be a few eyebrows raised around the city about this, if you haven't heard it already, because it was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever heard at the UN.
AI. What will it mean? Helpful robots washing and caring for an aging population, or pink-eyed terminators sent back from the future to cull the human race? What will synthetic biology stand for? Restoring our livers and our eyes with miracle regeneration of the tissues like some fantastic hangover cure? Or will it bring terrifying limbless chickens to our tables? Will nanotechnology help us to beat disease, or will it leave tiny robots to replicate in the crevices of our souls? It is a trope as old as literature that any scientific advance is punished by the gods. When Prometheus brought fire to mankind in a tube of fennel, as you may remember, with his brother Epimetheus, Zeus punished him by chaining him to a Tartarian crag while his liver was pecked out. I talked about a hangover cure. His liver was pecked out by an eagle, and every time his liver regrew, the eagle came back and pecked it again. And this went on forever. A bit like the experience of Brexit in the UK. If some of our parliamentarians had their way.
Well, that's Boris speaking at the UN in New York a couple of weeks ago. What's he doing invoking Prometheus, Ron?
I don't know. It seems like somebody spiked his drink before he went into the United Nations. His notion that very advance in science has always been punished by the gods, I think it's a misreading of the 20th century. I mean, science is the new religion. You would not have any advances in science, basically, if it was not generally recognized as being a progressive force for our civilization. So I don't know what he was making reference to there. I think artificial intelligence obviously is a very important potential scientific advance. Obviously it has economic and even medical applications and provides potential benefits for society. But I didn't quite get the analogy between that and Parliament in the debates over Brexit.
And he didn't. Well, I mean, he did raise a laugh as a joke about comparing it to Brexit. But look, at the end of the day, he's not really addressing the main issue about AI and these technologies, which is ownership. Who actually owns and controls those technologies?
Exactly.
So, is there anything you think we can do to make sure that these technologies are something which benefits the whole of society, rather than just the few people that have invested in it and own it?
That's true for any form of technology. I mean, technology is not neutral. Technology basically has inherently possible consequences for human relationships, the impact on the environment, on our well-being. And I think I've only followed the debate over AI in terms of medical diagnosis. There's been a whole debate about how beneficial AI compared basically to human intervention by medical experts to be able to make diagnosis. And there's a debate whether or not AI basically could trump or outperform medical practitioners. But there's other literature basically that says medical practitioners are much more reliable.
So I'm going to put on our podcast a couple of interviews. One is from Truth Stream Media, which is their review of a book by Gerald Feinberg called The Prometheus Project
by Gerald Feinberg, and it was published in 1969. And this guy, his bio says he's a professor of physics at Columbia. He received a BA, an MA, and PhD from there. He spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Physics in Princeton and 2 years at Brookhaven, there on Long Island, home of the RHIC Collider. And then a year at Rockefeller University, which probably helped cement the ideas that he's promoting in this book. But he's been published all over the place. Scientific American, the Annual Review of Nuclear Physics, Science at V, lots of others. He's written whole books on quantum physics. In fact, this guy coined the term tachyon, the hypothetical faster-than-light particles. He also predicted the existence of the muon neutrino, and he sat on the advisory panel for the Foresight Institute in Palo Alto, which is a huge promoter of nanotechnology.
AI, cyberspace, neurotechnology, health technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, cryptocommerce, and space.
And other transhumanist technologies.
Our big dumb universe is a supersaturated solution for intelligence. We get to be the seed crystal, the time that determines what kind of crystal we are, to be the seed crystal.
And I think it's interesting that this particular book was published by Doubleday. It's a very mainstream publisher, and it's obvious that this was a message they wanted to be spread very widely to the masses in 1969, no less. So at a very particular moment during the rise of the CIA-led counterculture movement. Feinberg opens by calling for the formulation of long-range goals of the human race, saying that he hopes to convince his readers that due to the increase in technological advances, it's imperative that humanity come up with uniformed goals, unify us all, and to alleviate disagreements over major issues that could lead to what he calls, quote-unquote, the early destruction of the human race, which is a very peculiar phrase, the early destruction of the human race. It suggests that there will be a planned destruction of the human race. He just doesn't want it to come early. The planned destruction of the human race has to do with transhumanism.
Transhumanists look forward to a future in which Homo sapiens is superseded by a better, smarter, fitter model, humanity 2.0.
And this idea that we will become something other than human once we transcend this phase of Homo sapien to the next level through directed human evolution. He's hinting at that with the language that he chooses to use here.
The fundamental hallmarks of the human species are about to be redesigned.
And he says, though, that these goals won't count unless it involves a large portion of the human race, so he's going to lay out what this goal should be for everyone. I just want to point out the fact that in this book, the entire idea is predicated on the claim that he makes that science has not shown any evidence for the existence of a soul or of God.
Just because we can't prove something scientifically doesn't mean it's not there. We can't prove a mother's love for her child, but that doesn't mean it's not there. It's a matter of the heart. And matters of the heart can't be fathomed by the mind.
So those don't exist because there's no evidence.
Now we're here at the Internet Archive, which is a former church.
But he then goes on to say, in the future, we may be able to find the aliens by using radio signals. So God and the soul are apparently just totally scientifically invalid concepts, but aliens, completely possible. I just think that point needs to be made. The purpose of this book, he says, is to propose a group effort, which I call the Prometheus Project. He goes on to claim that he chose that title simply because of the Greek word meaning foresight, but Prometheus was the legendary figure who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans, and was therefore sentenced to eternal torment. And many people have pointed out the parallels between Prometheus and Lucifer. It's pretty obvious. Lucifer means light bringer. He too was judged for bringing the knowledge of good and evil to Adam and Eve.
From Truthstream Media, which is their review of a book by Gerald Feinberg called The Prometheus Project. And another is the Prometheus Legend. This is William Cooper talking about the Prometheus Legend as opposite and opposing the Genesis idea of the Garden of Eden, saying that Satan tempted man. What they're saying is actually Satan was doing something good in the Prometheus legend and challenging man to use his expertise to become God himself.
Here's the way they look at it. Here's their metaphor for the end of innocence. Adam and Eve were held prisoner in the Garden of Eden by an unjust, cruel, and vindictive God. Until Lucifer, through his agent Satan, set man free from this garden by giving him the gift of intellect. Through the use of intellect, man will conquer the earth, will conquer nature, and will himself become God. It's taught in every Masonic temple in this land. Every secret brotherhood, every secret society, every mystical temple, every occult organization teaches the Luciferian philosophy. They do not believe in Lucifer. They do not believe in any entity called a devil, and they do not believe in God. It is a mistake for you to assume that they do. They are atheists in the strictest sense of the word. They are humanists. That's their religion. At the highest level, their goal is to create a world in which the adepts, the 1,000 points of light, working behind the veil to create the culmination of the great plan, can realize the ultimate happiness for mankind. That's why they don't oppose pornography. That's why they don't oppose certain crimes. That's why they say you should not be put in jail for the rest of your life for murder or anything else. There should be no death penalty, because it was a learning experience. And having gone through that learning experience, you're a better person now. This is what they teach. They believe punishment for these crimes is nothing more than vengeful retribution, which is wrong in their eyes. So these are really the two philosophies that we have competing with each other in the world today. Who brought man the gift of fire? Prometheus. Who was Prometheus? Lucifer. What was the gift of fire? Knowledge, intellect. Hasn't man created industry, culture, society, science from the use of one solitary thing? Fire. Without fire, none of it would have occurred. None of it. Nothing. There would be no society without fire. That's how it's represented in the ancient myths and in the mysteries. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?
William Cooper talking about the Prometheus legend as opposing the Genesis idea of the Garden of Eden. I'd like to move on to have a listen to Rabbi Michael Lerner, because we're coming towards the end, Ron, who's the author of this book, The Left Hand of God, Taking Back Our Faith from the Christian Right, which is really about a move away from a spiritual and faith-based society to a more secular society. And I'd be interested in your comments when we've heard from Rabbi Michael Lerner.
There's a deep spiritual crisis in people's lives, and is rooted in, number one, the deprivation of the desire for meaning and purpose in the world of work. And people are deprived of the capacity to use their time in a way that connects to some higher meaning and purpose. Now, this was astounding to us because we didn't realize, coming from a kind of academic or intellectual or progressive background, we always sort of had this prejudice that we were on a higher level, and that most working people were as just concerned about money. And summed up by James Carville, who said, "It's the economy, stupid." But what we were learning from people was that there was a hunger for something much more than that people really felt deprived of a capacity to use their life to connect to higher meaning and purpose. So that was one level of a spiritual crisis, that people felt like their lives were being wasted all day in the world of work because the bottom line was money and power, and they were learning day after day that if they did not spend all of their time and energy maximizing money and power for their corporation or for wherever they were working, they were going to get downsized out of a job. But then on the other hand, the other thing they were learning at the world of work is just to look at other people from the framework of what can you be of use to me? And internalizing a consciousness about other people basically says, I have to look out for number one. Nobody else is going to take care of me. So it's a kind of utilitarian framework in which you see other people through the frame of what can you do for me? But then people bring that home into personal life, and they feel surrounded by other people who have learned the rationality of the marketplace in which everybody's looking out for number one. And as a result of that, relationships start to become much weaker. People feel they're surrounded by people who only care about themselves, and they feel misrecognized. Nobody really sees who they are. Instead, they are only seen through the framework of what can this person do for this other person? In other words, nobody sees who I really am, is what people were telling me. They're saying, even my kids only look at me from the standpoint of what I can do for them. Even my spouse looks at me from the standpoint of what can I do for her or for him. So people are feeling increasingly lonely, even in their marriages, even in their family life, and scared that even those relationships may quickly collapse, because in a society in which everybody's looking out for number one, you have very little certainty that your own spouse won't at some point find somebody who they think could satisfy more of their needs than you can, and then because they're a rational maximizer of self-interest that is looking out for number one, they're going to leave you and go to this next person. So there's a tremendous amount of fear and upset about living in a society where there's so much selfishness and materialism.
So that was Rabbi Michael Lerner there. He's the author of Left Hand of God, Taking Back Our Faith from the Christian Right. And, I mean, this idea of us being rational maximisers of self-interest, Ron, what he's saying there is it doesn't really fit with traditional sorts of human relationships based on love and respect. This kind of business relationship is something completely different, and that's where we're heading.
Well, actually, struck a chord with me, because we're living still within a neoliberal age, basically, which obviously puts primary value on economic maximization for the individual or for the corporation or any business entity. But when I was listening to him, what actually struck me is that he was raising an existentialist question. What are we on Earth for? What is the purpose of our lives? And it also struck an analogy with a very famous psychologist by the name of Albert Maslow, who talked about the hierarchy of needs, which had a tremendous influence on the New Left in the 1960s, because he talked about once you fulfill your material needs, there are higher needs which speak to human relationships. And basically, he talked about the need for self-actualization, self-realization. And this spurred basically a whole movement to explore different ways of living, maybe collective or communal ways of living, which basically seen as basically as a challenge, basically, to materialistic age of the 50s and 1960s in American society.
BCFM. Well, let's look at some news, finally. Catalonia protests, marches and general strike has been paralysing Barcelona with the imprisonment of 9 politicians in Catalonia for their being supportive of a referendum which decided that they wanted to secede from Spain, Ron. This is a pretty explosive story here. In that what we're seeing is elected politicians being put behind bars for actually doing what they said they do at a referendum.
Exactly right, and being generally supported by the population within Catalonia. And I think the crisis that basically is developing is basically hard to even foresee a resolution of that crisis, as the demonstrations now are becoming much more confrontational. So
should the Spanish government just give up and say, OK, you can have your secession, you can secede from Spain?
Well, if there's a will, there's a way. And I think imprisoning people who are basically talking about independence for Catalonia, I don't think is the way forward.
I mean, they sound to me to be heading towards some sort of civil war over there. We've seen, just tonight, there's a lot of fires. What they're doing is they're basically rioting now.
Yes, it's very interesting when you look at that, the way that the media handles the protests in Catalonia with how they handle the protests in Hong Kong.
Yeah, very different.
Hong Kong basically, the students basically are seen as paragons of democracy, while in Catalonia basically they're seen as troublemakers.
Okay. And final headline, the Kurds have agreed to abide by US-Turkey ceasefire. So hopefully that big paddy whack that was all over the mainstream press for the last goodness knows how long is gone. You'll find this show's podcast, story links and show page thisweek.org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Have a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Our sister show Dialects here on Tuesday at noon. Do please join us for the Politics Show at 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Live from the Sky News Centre.